Good evening. Welcome to the East Hampton Library. Today we have with us John Tepper Marlin, and John Tepper Marlin will be discussing a recent book that he has transcribed titled Under Nazi Noses. A little bit about the book and John Tepper Marlin. John Tepper Marlin first learned about the resistance from his mother, Hilda van Stockum, who was second cousin to the hero of the book. Their grandfathers, Jan and Charles, were brothers. Van Stockum wrote a popular children's book, The Winged Watchman, which was published by Farrar, Straus back in 1962 and then reprinted by Bethlehem Books in 1995, in which Walraven appears as a resistant leader, Kees Kip. Dr. Marlin earned degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and George Washington universities. He served as chief economist for 3 New York City comptrollers and was a federal government economist in Washington, D.C. under Johnson, Nixon, Obama, and Trump. He's a frequent speaker before alumni groups and other associations, and we are proud to have John Tepper Marlin as our speaker today.
Okay. All right. My name is John Tepper Marlin, and I am the translator of this book, and annotator and editor. And well, I came from a Gold Star Dutch home. My mother and my grandmother were both at home. My father was away in working for the OSS in Europe. So they did speak Dutch at home all the time, but they didn't want me, whatever it was, they never taught me Dutch because they wanted me not to know what they were saying. It was all about the war. They talked constantly about the war. My uncle was killed in the week of D-Day. Flew for the RAF, was buried with honors in France. And it's been recently an obsession to find out what my grandmother and mother were talking about at home. And I'm so glad to have more than one relative here today, but the closest is Kim Buck is her uncle, her great uncle was the brother of Wally's mother. And he was the person that Wally was named after, but they have different spelling because it was a mistake in the bureaucracy. And the family was easygoing. They said, fine, we'll add the N. It's actually a more common name. That's just my grandmother, my mother, and that's Willem, who died in the war. I'm very sorry. I never knew him very well. There aren't too many of us left who are siblings or nephews or nieces of people who died in the war. All right, he was a naval captain, so there's an interesting, he was put down a rebellion in Java, so we have both sides of the Dutch experience in the family, both the pre-colonial and the post-colonial, and this is what happened on May 10th, 1940. Germans invaded without warning. Hitler had said, "We will never invade our Dutch cousins." You can count on that. They were neutral in World War I, and he promised to observe the neutrality of the Netherlands and Belgium too. But especially the Netherlands. And they expected little resistance. But the Dutch army actually shot down 100 Luftwaffe planes. And Goering was furious and Hitler was outraged. And they were determined to put down this obstreperous little country that they had almost ignored in their planning. And they bombed Rotterdam just to make sure they understood that Holland was not going to be in their way. They were on their way to conquer Europe, And if it cost a few Dutch cities so much, the worse for them. So then there was a period of the phony war when the Germans hoped that the Dutch would be like the Austrians and would join the German dream and would lead to world domination or European domination, at least, of by the Germans. And the first thing he got involved in, because he was a sailor, he wanted to be a sailor. The first thing he got involved in was the rescuing of the families of seamen, because one of the things that Seyss Inquart, the High Commissioner of Holland, Hitler's representative in Holland, one of the things he did was that if you are on a Dutch ship or you are a sailor on any ship and you don't come back between your stints overseas, we will stop giving you pension. Well, pensions would be they were retired, but if they're away and you get a pension, they're stopped. And if you are away and you don't come back, your salary is stopped. So suddenly all these widows and families and wives and families were stranded, and he stepped up and he said, I'm a sailor, I have to help them. And he created something called the Zeemanspot. The Zeemanspot is something you set up when a seaman died at sea. And the neighborhood would set up a collection, a pot, and they would people would put money in the pot, as it were, and then you would give the money to the widow. And that's what he did. So, and one of the ways he made friends was through the Dutch Union. One of the things that the Germans allowed at first was that you could form a political party. Now, it wasn't supposed to be anti-Nazi, and the people at the top were very friendly and tried to do things, but eventually the Dutch Union was outlawed, but the people that they made friends with in the Dutch Union became the core of the resistance. So first of all, he got collections, people donated the traditional way, then he borrowed money, and then the borrower said, I know you promised to pay us back after the war, but we'd like the guarantee from the Queen, which he got via Radio Orange. But it took a long time, and he was working without that. And one of the ways he gave receipts was he found something numbered that would be harmless. Nobody wanted a receipt saying this is for contribution to something that the Nazis didn't want. So here's Joan Baum just did a review on NPR, and I'm so grateful for it. And she said, how do you explain the fact that the Amsterdam is supposed to be the world's most liberal city, and yet the country that had the most deaths among the Jews was the Netherlands? How did that happen? 85% were multi-generation, and oh, great, thank you. 85% were multi-generation, and how do you explain it? So there's a puzzle. One answer is that they were trapped. A lot of the just let me get a sip of this. A lot of the Dutch people, Dutch Jews, had come from Germany, but many had been there for many generations, and but they couldn't get out, because as soon as it became obvious that they should leave, it was like Germany. A lot of them waited until it was too late. And then here you can see, this was the German plan. They didn't even pay any attention to the Netherlands. They were not going to get in their way. But if you look at the German plan, the Nazi plan, I guess we like the Germans now. The Nazi plan was to go into Belgium in a big way And you can see what the plan was. This was a pretty telling map, because it shows how the Netherlands was not even a thought. So Erik Schaap is the original Dutch author of this book. I'm going to write another book after this one, but I knew that I had to find this book, get this book in English, or I wouldn't be able to make much progress on my own book about my own family and what they did, and which they are part of. This is Erik Schaap, and I wanted to meet him in 2018. I went to Zandam, but he wasn't around, and I came back in 2023, and we met. Alice, my wife, was with me, and that's him. And he did a whole lot of research that would be beyond me to do, and the letters, and he went into the archives. And he was doing this because he was it was the place where Wally lived. It's where he was a neighbor of where Wally lived. And so in a way, it's like Shintoism is about your place, and he has kind of a worship of place, and that's I explain his motivation. He's very proud of the people who lived in his area. They were so. Here are the four boys. There were four boys in the family, and Wally is the one holding Beppo, who's younger than Heist, and Floor. That's an abbreviation for Flores. Heist and Flora are the two other brothers. And it was 1929. The two brothers came to the United States. What do you think that they would have found when they went to New York City in 1929? They would have learned a lot about finance, and they would have sort of not totally trusted financial institutions, and they would have learned a lot, and that will come into play later. They learned a lot about financial dealings, good and bad. So this really was a love story. It's written in the book, and it's important because of how loyal Tilly was to him, and how eager she was to do what had to be done. And she said, I don't like what you're doing for the resistance, but there's nobody else who can do it but you. And you have to, I'm not giving you permission, but I'm not objecting. So here is Wally. That's his face. That's the original cover. I don't know how far that would have sold in the United States. It does not clear what it's about. He's not a household word, Walraven van Hal, although he should be. So he first begged for money, then he borrowed money, and then he said, I don't know what, we're kind of tapped out. People don't have money. And suddenly the breaking point for him was when the Queen said, we want all of the railway workers in Holland to go on strike. Well, what are the odds of that if they're losing their salaries? It's not very high. So he had to find a way to get money to the railway workers, and there were 30,000 of them. So the only place he could think of going to get this money was the central bank of the Netherlands. That's the only place that has the kind of money that we're talking about at that time. So the expectation was on the Queen's part that it was going to be a short while before the Allies would win. And if you can see from this chart, this is Arnhem up here, and the Allies were starting back here in Belgium in this is the Second Army. And you can see the Brits are here, and the Americans are here, and the Americans are here, and the Brits are, they were right in the middle of all this. There you can see the Brits. And they were told with certainty by their intelligence service, the M5, M6, MI5, MI6. They were told that the Germans were on their backs. There was no problem. We will be sweeping through. Their tanks are useless, et cetera, et cetera. And the resistance said, it's not true. They're waiting in the woods. They're organized. They're waiting in the woods. And Montgomery said, don't ever trust the resistance. They don't know. They're not organized. They don't know. And so Montgomery said, let's go ahead. And this was why the war in Holland lasted nearly a year longer than in France. D-Day was in June of 1944, and the war ended in the Netherlands in May. And this was a disastrous year for the Netherlands, partly because the Queen did not call off the strike. The Queen, there was no way they could get food from the east to the west. There was a famine in the West. They were eating tulip bulbs, whole books about this whole thing. And the effects, they've even done studies of the effects on the families and how the lack of nutrition had permanent effects on people. So the new theory is, within the last couple of months, the new theory in Britain is that Blunt, one of the Cambridge Five, I hate to say Cambridge University Five. I didn't go to Cambridge, but anyway, he was one of the 5 spies that he was the one who got let off because the Queen liked him. The Queen that he was the Queen's advisor on art. And I know people who knew him and who were students of his, and they say he was a nice person. He just had a dual personality. Anyway, he tipped off Stalin. And Stalin decided, I mean, this is the theory, it's not proven, but there are lots of evidence, that Stalin fed the information through a back channel in Stockholm to Hitler. Why? They were mortal enemies, but he did not want the Allies to get to Berlin first. So thousands of people died in this Arnhem disaster, and thousands of people died in Holland during the famine. But it's ironic that this great effort of Wally van Hal, maybe if he'd been alive at the time of the, or water, excuse me. Maybe if he'd been alive at the time, he might have gotten through and told them, our information is good. Anyway, this is the bridge too far, and that's the American parachute infantry regiment. They said one of the paratroopers said to the other, "We're going to Holland, and we're not going to pick tulips." So they knew that this was going to be a very risky venture, and there's a poignant moment where they go back to where they set off on the way back. It's like Napoleon's retreat. And out of 20 people who were in one group, one flight group, out of 20 people, only 3 were left. Only 3 were left. So here is the Rainier Cool, one of the people who lived up his name. He provided monthly transfers for several months to help finance the resistance. And here is how they did it. They had an incredible counterfeiting operation, and this is what they had to counterfeit. If you can look at all the details, this thing, and then this border, and it had to look the same because they were constantly inspecting these things. What he did was, instead of trying to circulate them, he said, we will replace the ones in the bank vaults. So they got real ones out of the bank vaults and they put in the fake ones. So the only way they would get caught is if they did a routine check, which they did. and hope that they would pass muster. So they had an incredibly good counterfeiting operation because they were counterfeiting IDs for Jewish people, thousands and thousands of them, so they could survive an initial search. So they had their ID, it's okay, they could leave. Here is the office. This is the cashier general. He was on Wally's side. So he was, and he thought his two sons had died. Actually, they both survived the war, but he had thought at the time they had both died. He hadn't heard from them. So he was on the side. He would take risks for the resistance. And he was a key element of this. There was somebody on the inside, but nobody else below him knew what was going on. So he had to intervene when they started to get suspicious. So this is I can give you copies of all this. I'll be glad to send you a copy of these. So if you're interested in any of these details, I can give them to you. Here is the Dutch historian who he wrote the 24 volumes of information about the war and in the Netherlands. And Harvard picked him in 1987 to give the Erasmus lectures. And he said that Wally was a rare, true, quote, true hero, unquote, because one of the things he did was he would resolve disputes among the Dutch people. Before the war, the Dutch were fighting among themselves. There were the progressives, there were the conservatives, there were the different religious groups. It was a very, what they call pillarized society, where you voted along your religion and your beliefs. And Wally would smooth it over. He said that was a very rare and very important skill that he brought to his job. Published in 1988, and that's in English. So I gave this talk at the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam 2 months ago. And there are some of the people, some relatives who were with me planning. And I want to thank some other, I want to thank Rianne Osterman, some of the people who've helped me along the way. And that includes Kim Buck, and I say family, I should say Renee, her daughter, who's here, and there she is, and most importantly, Stephen, who's here, and Alec Baldwin for this great room, and of course at the bottom, last but not least, my wife Alice, who has been involved in all of this from the beginning. So here is my mother's story. Another reason I got interested in all this is that my mother has written a best-selling book. Last year she sold 6,000, and they were originally written in 1962. So this would you would call as a success. It's a children's book about the resistance, a family that lives in a windmill during the war and what it was like. And you can see the plane on the top is the only sign you have of the resistance. And it was optioned for a movie, but so far not. Here's the rest. I'm done with my talk, and I will be glad to answer questions.
I'm interested in what you said about Anthony Blunt, and I would, excuse me, and I wondered what the evidence is of him doing what you described.
What?
Yeah, I'm not doubting the Stalin, Hitler part of the story, because that sounds reasonable, and there might not be too much evidence, but I wondered what the evidence is of what Blunt actually did.
Right. But it's a great theory, even if it doesn't pan out, and it's still being discussed. And the reviews have been mixed. The reviews of his book, in which he puts out, it was published in London, and it's the reviews have been mixed. It's not proven, but it certainly does explain why the Dutch were so shocked at the at the Dutch and the Americans and the English were also shocked by the failure at Arnhem. The resistance was not shocked because they had warned them, but there were 3 divisions. If you remember that picture, maybe we should go back to that because it's a telling there at Bridge Too Far. You can see those, look up there at those 3. Well, there's 2 Panzer divisions. There's one, there's the other SS divisions. These are the ideologically committed Nazis, and they were the cream of their crop. And then you had another corps, and you had another corps here waiting, and then of course you had all these Germans retreating from Belgium, who had been regrouping up in the south, and they. I wanted to thank somebody else, Tony Sommerstein, who had read some of these chapters and commented, and I'm grateful for that. Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question. The quick answer is it's out for discussion, and everyone's looking, and it's a great theory though, because it shows, one piece of evidence we have, by the way, which is important, is that Blunt himself was distraught over the losses at Arnhem personally. So he may have made that connection. And these personal things may not carry much weight, but I think it's important. You have a question, or Stephen has a question, or you have a question.
I'm just wondering, John, since story reflects so well on the Dutch, why did it take so long for light? I mean, why didn't people know this story?
Oh, interesting
2006.
question. Thank you. That's Terry. Thank you very much. It's a very good question. And the question is, the underlying question is just generally, why is it taking so long for the story to come out? And the answer is, for one thing, after the war, the bankers were all very embarrassed about the bank robbery. And he wasn't honored by the central. They're now across the road from the central bank is a fake fallen tree. And people complain, why don't you take away this tree? It's so realistic. They write to the sanitation department of the city of Amsterdam and say, there's a fallen tree that needs to be removed. But it's a tree in honor of Wally van Hollen. But it took 70 years for that honor to be bestowed on him. And it could be that there are people involved who may not have played the best role in all of this, and they were reluctant to do anything to further this honoring. And there were 3 groups in the Netherlands. There was the people who just wanted to get by and kept their heads down, and that was by far the biggest group. And then there were the collaborators who saw an opportunity to prosper. And then there were the resistance. And the number of active resistance was quite small, but the number of people who supported them in small ways was quite high. So the quick answer is there was guilt to be shared by everybody. And there was pride to be shared by everybody, but in some cases, maybe their guilt was greater. And that's maybe we need a generation to pass before people are willing to step out and say, these were the true heroes.
Yeah. What Donna said to me in the past is that the reason is that the bankers themselves, I mean, were ashamed that a banker had stolen from the bank. They wanted to hide that you could steal from the bank, and they did not want one of their own to be accused of having carried out a heist against the bank. I found that a persuasive argument.
Thank you. Yes.
The counterfeit money was going out during the war, and it was out in the general population through other banks or whoever they gave the counterfeit for. How did they pull it back? I mean, is this after the war? Was the counterfeit money still out there and being used as legal?
The quick answer is everything Heist in the background. I mean, his wife did not support Heist the way that Tilly supported Wally. His wife said, we've got children, you know, you can support the, your brother, but, you know, try to stay out of the limelight. He did all the bookkeeping, and he was very brave to do that. My point is the answer to that question is the same answer that the borrowers wanted. How do we get our money back after the war? And Heist, in his home in Karen, in the Netherlands, what he did was keep detailed records in a way that if they were found, nobody would know what they were. But he would make a note of which of these counterfeit treasury bills were counterfeit. They knew that was a problem. And that's one reason they didn't want to just sell, you know, issue in the open market counterfeit treasury bills. They knew that after the war, and remember, they kept thinking it was going to be earlier. It's like the early Christians who expected the end of the world very soon. They expected the war to be over, and and that there would be an accounting, and they wanted to be sure that as borrowers they were going to be repaid. In the same way, the bankers wanted to be sure that after the war they could unwind all the counterfeiting. So we give credit to Heist for that. He later became mayor of Amsterdam. He survived the war and became mayor of Amsterdam. He had the provost on his watch, ironically, yes.
Was everyone compensated or repaid after the war for?
Everybody was repaid. Not a cent was missing. It was, it's hard to believe, but that's the record.
John,
Yes.
I was curious, a little sidebar. Was the Queen really so powerful that she could call a strike? She wasn't just a figurehead?
Not just a figurehead. She had a cabinet in London, and as far as they were concerned, they were running everything. And she did have power. She had the power to guarantee the bonds after the war. Everybody knew that after the war, we'd go back to normal. There'd be a reset before the so-called reset before the war. And they knew that the Queen would call the shots then. Everyone is loyal to the Queen. She is the heir to William I. You know, he's a sainted man in the Netherlands. The Wilhelmus, they sing the Wilhelmus as their national anthem. It's about him.
But you said something about her not calling off the strike early enough to
Yes,
prevent
now that's the puzzle. It's like the frog in the pan who doesn't realize that things are changing
heating
and
up.
stays in the pan. And that's what happened. The Queen didn't want to show weakness, or her cabinet didn't want to show weakness. Winston Churchill said of the Dutch cabinet, the only man among them is the Queen. So she was the strongest of the cabinet. She was clear leader of the cabinet. She fired her first prime minister because he was pusillanimous.
Dutch ever resent the fact that the Queen left them?
Oh,
Only
there was
kept
no, I mean,
herself
there's
safe.
no question that, remember, there are 3.5 million German, the army of Germany was 3.5 million soldiers. We now have 1% of our population under arms. During the war, our maximum was 12%. Germany, that 3.5 million is a huge number. And they knew that all these were heading towards, to take France. They were on their way to invade France via Belgium and Holland. And they didn't really need Holland. They just figured they would be easier to thank you for coming. Holland, the south of Holland. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Oh yeah. So why didn't she change her mind? Well, and all these ironies of history are only evident when you look back. At the time, again, the frog in the pan, no one knew when the war was going to end. Nobody knew it would take eight more months for the Allied armies to regroup. It was very difficult for Montgomery, for Eisenhower, to try to deal with the Dutch question, because they're all around. That's one of the points about trying to get out of Holland. You're totally surrounded on the North Sea. So taking Holland was not a priority for Eisenhower or for Montgomery. But they didn't know that. Looking back on it, it makes a lot of sense.